Welcome to Soft Landing. I'm Roland Smith, and today we're going to dive into the subject of borders. National borders, of course. But no, this is not a chat about fences or gates. This is about the cultures, identities, and psychologies that those borders foster, whether at the border itself or away from it. Now, it's fair to say borders have been at the heart of Europe's history for some considerable time. They run through the history of the European Union, the EU's principle of freedom of movement in particular, and of course borders and freedom of movement became a central issue in Britain's relationship with the EU. It feels like we in the UK are rather fond of our borders, whereas others in Europe are less fond. Why? To discuss all this, I'm delighted to be joined by Lewis Baston. Now, Lewis is author of the book Borderlines, A History of Europe in 29 Borders, and has written on British politics and the electoral landscape for some 30 years, including for the Financial Times and The Guardian. He's also appeared on BBC television and radio across a variety of mainly political programmes, as well as holding research positions at the Electoral Reform Society and Democratic Audit. Hello, Lewis.
Hello, Roland. It's a great pleasure to be on your podcast and to have a nice chat.
Yeah, absolutely that. So let's dive into this. What I propose is that we touch on some borders in Western Europe, and we absolutely must mention the curious town of Bala along the way, which I think is fascinating. Mm-hmm. After that, maybe some key borders in Eastern Europe, especially a bit on Ukraine, before bringing the conversation back to the UK and our own borders, especially with Ireland. I have to say, the book is really, really good. A great read, and having picked it up again in advance of this session, I'd say it is something of an affectionate travellogue around Europe. Would you say that's true?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of love in this book. I have the sort of disposition of mind that I'm inclined to like places and people, even if they have a bit of a bad reputation. So I've been to a number of fairly unglamorous towns along the borders of Europe, and I've generally found something to like and something to be intrigued by about. So I love the travel and the encounters that one has on the way. And it is a book which is a sort of bit of a love letter to Europe.
Right, okay. I mean, I suppose for me and for a lot of people, one of the biggest divides through Europe is the sort of, I'll say it's the Franco-German border, but it's more than that. It's a linguistic border that runs all the way from the North Sea right down through Switzerland, which I have some connections, family connections. But can we perhaps kind of just focus in on that a little bit?
It is this sort of Franco-German border which we approximate to the Rhine, although it obviously doesn't follow the Rhine all the way. It is one of Europe's oldest borders. You can see its imprint really in the Roman Empire and onwards, and in Charlemagne's empire and its divisions. So the Treaty of Verdun, for instance, which is 743, I think was the year it was. Do please, Roland, check that.
We'll run with that for now.
So it is one of the oldest fault lines in Europe, this sort of Franco-German border. But even then, it's nailed down politically surprisingly late. There are a lot of places where France has had political influence in places that speak German, or you've had French-speaking places which are part of the sort of structure of the Holy Roman Empire, which was a predominantly German thing. So it's a clear fault line, but even then it's kind of fuzzy around the edges. And it's quite interesting the way this border shows up in internal borders within federal nations in Europe. They call it the Wurstigraben in Switzerland, that there's this sort of Franco-German difference. You can also see it. It's the linguistic frontier across Belgium between the French-speaking and the Dutch-speaking parts of Belgium. And because Belgium is a complicated place, there is a sort of fractal complexity to Belgium. There are little exceptions and special cases, but there is this linguistic divide running across the country which reflects this very old, very deep sort of border across Europe. And on the other side of Germany, you've got another one. You've got this sort of boundary between Germandom and Slavic civilizations. That one is, if anything, kind of more mobile than the Franco-German one, partly because of the geography of the territory. that there's no real natural border between Berlin and Moscow.
There's a lot of history in that latter border, isn't there, in the last hundreds or so years? I was just curious what you said about the Holy Roman Empire, actually, and Charlemagne and all of that, because for me, those were almost like a big swirl of identities all kind of merged together without what we have now as the modern day borders of nations. So I'm fascinated here that actually that linguistic border goes back so long, which I presume obviously it should. Why wouldn't it? But that's kind of interesting to me.
Oh, sure. It's old, but there has always been fuzziness around the edges a bit as well, in the sense that you have in Alsace, you have people who were basically, and this is part of the reason there's been conflict when we try and nail down these areas into nation states. You have people in Alsace who spoke effectively a German dialect, but who had a French political and civic identity. So you had this squabble between France and Germany, who both define nationality and nationhood in different ways in the 19th century. And you had the projects of constructing nation states and conflicts between different ways of looking at that.
Okay, so I was going to say, was it more peaceful at what have become borders, national borders, back in the days of empire?
The thing with the empires is that you can tolerate a certain amount of ambiguity within an empire. I mean, the Holy Roman Empire was famously neither Holy Roman nor an empire. But it was this political superstructure above this mass of tiny statelets. And you had the big state, which was Austria and then displaced by Prussia, which was the leading power in them. And you had obviously massive internal religious and political conflicts at stages within it. But other empires too, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was a very complex system of managing difference within its borders. And you can see, I think, some of the origins of the political project of the EU in these earlier empires. You have something which aims to square the circle of sovereignty and cooperation. The Holy Roman Empire in particular, I mean, the little states were kind of completely absurd things. There were sort of over 300 fragments. And this is the thing about the old map of Europe, that there were periods when it was incredibly fragmented. Parcels of land would be traded back and forward between rulers. There was no real regard to kind of what we think of as how you build a nation state, as to whether the people speak the same sorts of language, or there's even territorial contiguity, so you can end up with a little state that has a random parcel of land completely detached from the main part of it. So it is really in the sort of 18th and 19th centuries that you have this rationalization of borders. I'm simplifying a lot here, but
of course,
the nation state is a pretty recent development in historical terms, and the idea of firm borders between them is, if anything, even more recent.
How recent are we talking?
Well, borders didn't used to do some of the things that we now expect at borders. Even sort of turn of the 20th century, you had a system where people could cross borders really quite easily. I mean, there was very little migration control. What there was customs control, that you could cross a lot of these borders without a passport, but customs officers would go through all your goods at the border railway station, and you'd have to pay duty on kind of whatever sort of, if you're carrying a cigar case, you might have to end up paying a bit of duty on the cigars in it. Going back even a bit further, you would end up quite a lot of that sort of thing. Customs and control of people would often take place at the city gate rather than at the national boundary.
Okay.
And in rural areas, there were kind of relationships where people were attached to the land. But in urban areas, you pay your duty, you'd be checked over at the city gate. And the nation state and the bureaucratic state grew together in the 18th and 19th century. Right. And it was the ideas of the French Revolution as well that it's a big push towards clarifying all these relationships which had been left fuzzy for centuries.
But you say they've been clarified, and you're right. But I mentioned in my introduction this curious town of Bala, which rationalization and neatness just seems to have completely passed by. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Bala is a very peculiar place. It is on the border of the Netherlands and Belgium, and it is actually physically located a bit into the Netherlands. but part of the town is in Belgium. So you've got Baarle-Nassau, which is Netherlands, and Baarle-Hertog, which is Belgium. And it's not even rationally divided between the two. It is a mad chessboard of little squares of territory. So you can cross the border about 10 times, more than 10 times, on a short walk around town. And there are places where there's one house, which is Belgian, or there's a place where the national border goes through somebody's front door. And the reason it's like this, it is incredible. I mean, they make a certain amount as a tourist attraction. That you can,
right.
you can
I was going to wonder about that, yeah.
Enjoy the absurdity of these borders. It didn't used to be special. There used to be a lot of areas where it was like this, that you'd have some sort of transaction between two feudal kind of rulers. So the Duke of Brabant and some other lord traded a bit of territory. And the weird thing about Baarle is it was never ironed out. And there were several opportunities through history where it might have been. There was even a bit of talk about Belgium annexing some territory from the Netherlands after the First World War. There were also surveyors who tried to map the frontier, and they just gave up for Baarle. So part of Baarle's identity is it's the gap between these two sort of marker posts when they tried to define the border properly. And so the anomaly was finally mapped in the 1990s. Some people then realised that based on the old maps, they thought they'd been living in Belgium, but actually they were in the Netherlands. There was one old lady who found herself reclassified, and she was furious about this. She sort of said, I've lived 84 years as a Belgian, I'm not suddenly going to become Dutch. And so they eventually found a solution to this, that they moved her front door back into Belgium so she could be Belgian again.
When you say her front door was moved, sorry, her front door must have moved within her house.
It did, yes. The border was sufficiently close to her house that there was it was a new building, and there was a front door and a window by the front door where you have your little table. And they basically just swapped the window and the door round. And that was sufficient to get her. That was enough to get her into Belgium. There's another building which I visited, which is even weirder. Like, there's the international equivalent of a flying freehold. And this is because of Dutch planning law, that you couldn't have more than 2 Dutch flats from that door. So they have a Belgian door that goes onto the same lobby. And the first floor flat is in Belgium, whereas the flats sort of above and below are in the Netherlands.
Extraordinary.
So you have this international consequence, as it were. Okay, a trivial and absurd one. But it's basically about the municipal planning law of Baarle-Nassau kind of creates this sort of international anomaly. So it's a funny place. I mean, the cops go around in pairs because they otherwise the sort of shoplifter could run away across the border and defy them to be extradited back.
I was going to say, how does it work? Because they're completely different. Well, they're not completely different systems, but they are different systems of tax and of various laws, and they're both in the EU, clearly. But how does that work?
It works because people want to make it work. I mean, there are funny things, like people send their kids across the border for education sometimes, and people there are actually quite good at making the system work for them, choosing which jurisdiction to work under. It would all be incredibly difficult if people were bloody minded about it. That things like planning and public services and even stuff like the street lights, there are different rules for the street lights on each side. So they've rigged up a system whereby they can turn off the lights in one jurisdiction and not in another in the small hours of the night. And planning and so on takes a while. It took a while to plan their ring road. It involved a certain amount of form filling and tediousness. But it was done. And people there live a regular sort of prosperous, bourgeois, North European life. And it's not a bad place to be. And some people are really intrigued by the borders, and they have this sort of little sixth sense as to which country they're in at any given time. Although a lot of people just live regardless of it. And I think it's one of these things where we as British sort of maybe struggle to get into that mentality that a border is actually something not that important.
Yeah. I was just going to say that. I think absolutely that. We have a very neat and tidy kind of mindset. Probably more the English than anything, because England is England, and it's been England for goodness knows how long. And yeah, we just don't understand that. So yeah, I think we can't quite get our heads around everything you've just described about Bala.
Yeah. I mean, it is a little piece of Europeanism on the ground in that, yeah, the national border is too absurd to work as a hard line. You've got to have a soft border. Yes, it involves a certain amount of give and take. It involves a lot of quite tedious administration. And I thought at some time, okay, this is all sort of very funny, but actually it's a sort of metaphor for the EU, really.
Yeah.
If the two bits of Bala can work together to do stuff like have a sewage system, for instance, in this town, or put a bypass around it, then it shouldn't be beyond the wit of larger governments to sort out larger things to mutual advantage. So yeah, this is something that came up a lot for me in thinking about borders, is that there are often absurdities, but the absurdities sometimes point to ways of people rubbing along and cooperating, that they're a bit of a challenge to us to sort out a way of doing it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's what really came out of your book for me, is just this cultural impact that borders have these days, I should say. I really must stress that, in that they have this sort of blended identity, ambiguity, and ambiguous identity as well in those vicinities. I mean, something I noticed, and I mentioned this earlier, so I have Swiss family through my mother's side, and that's the very northeast corner of Switzerland, right on the Austrian border. And something I always notice when I'm there, because we often go into Austria, and this is all around the Lake Bodensee, there's almost a Bodensee kind of culture around that lake that obviously impacts Austria, Switzerland, Germany. And again, I just don't think Brits really get that, how these cultures blend together and are layered in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't make it to the east end of the Bodensee, which does seem to be this sort of little metro area which spans 3 countries. So I was intrigued by it. I did get to Constance, which was intriguing. You have this city which geographically looks like it should be in Switzerland, but actually it's in Germany, and a border running through the town, and that is actually cross freely between Germany and Switzerland at this point. Yeah. And there's an art project along the border. Soft borders are often the subject of things like art projects and nature projects and so on. It's quite, to my way of thinking, it's quite fun.
Gentle stuff.
Yeah. My favourite decommissioned border thing was a border post between Germany and Belgium, which had been converted into a florist's. And I just had this image of these cross-border commuters from Aachen to Eupen stopping off and buying flowers for their partners on the way home. I just thought it was something lovely and cosy. Unfortunately, the florist has shut up shop now since I wrote the book. But that may be a metaphor.
I mean, that's interesting about Constance. I don't think I've actually been to that part of the border, but clearly there are still border posts around Switzerland because it is not fully integrated into the EU. It is not an EU member, albeit it's a very close country to the EU. But yeah, you still have to go through these border posts, but it does seem to be quite free-flowing. And unless you have a sheep in the back of your car, that might be a bit different.
Oh yes, borders and agriculture are a whole subject, yeah. I have friends who live in Basel, and Basel's interesting to me because the metro area spans 3 countries. You've got bus and tram lines going into Germany and France. And there's this whole thing with the Swiss border cities of cross-border working, enormous numbers of people crossing the border.
And shopping, I think, as well.
And shopping, although shopping is slightly naughty. There is a sort of frisson of, you can be stopped if they feel like it by the Swiss customs. You can be charged sort of import duty on groceries from the Lidl across the border in Germany.
Yes.
Whereas, it is a bit of a remnant of this sort of older way of policing borders where people could go freely, but goods were sort of strictly controlled. I didn't actually make it there, but I was curious about CERN in Geneva. You have this literally a cross-border installation where people can probe the further limits of particle physics. And
this is the Large Hadron Collider and all that, yeah.
And they whiz particles across the Franco-Swiss border kind of thousands of times per second. I probably understate. It's probably some sort of astronomical number of border crossings a proton goes through.
Yes, but it beats our small boats crossing the channel.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to move this on a little bit. So you mentioned before about the other big border that runs through Europe, which is the Germanic Slavic border. Now, it goes without saying that the Franco-German border, as I described it, has had a lot of friction, and we're talking here about the two world wars in the 20th century, but the same is true, is it not, of the Germanic Slavic border? And it's just been horrendous things have happened there over time around the Oder-Neisse line. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this border is incredibly vexed. I mean, its 20th century history is grim, probably even more so than the Franco-German border, which has probably a longer history. Well, no, I say a longer history. The Slavic-German border has a very old history as well. Old maps can be really deceptive about how real borders were. Though if you look at a map from 1,000 years ago, you'll see Poland kind of where it is now. And subsequently, you get sort of waves of demographic change. And sometimes this is violent, sometimes it's about military conquest, and sometimes it's more to do with settling and so on. But this border moves around a lot, that there is a lot of what was not sort of Nazi conquest or anything like that, but a lot of kind of mainstream legit Germany, which was to the east of where Germany is now. The movements on this side between Germandom and Slavdom have often been incredibly violent.
Yeah.
That there was the Nazi project, obviously, of extending Germany far to the east and basically removing ethnic cleansing and murdering Poles and Jews who were there. There was the Nazi idea of a sort of German imperium extending into Ukraine and Russia, and a sort of line of settler farmers policing the frontier far to the east. Then you also had a long-standing Russian imperial desire to control the zone as far as the Oder. The Oder River is part of the current border between Germany and Poland. You can see it on the War Aims map of Russia in 1915. And Stalin was able to achieve this goal in 1945 and after. At the cost was the expulsion of millions of Germans from places where they had lived, or German sort of communities had lived for hundreds of years. And this was replicated within Czechoslovakia as well, that there was a sort of mingled German and Czech population in a lot of Czechoslovakia, and that was ended. So you have the end of hundreds of years of German settlement, and often the replacement by people who've been kicked out of Ukraine and Belarus for being Polish. I mean, there was the idea that after 1945, I mean, and you can see this developing even in the 1930s, that the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and that Paris Peace Conference had tried to create states that were nation states but had recognized minorities within them. The thinking sort of 1945 was that these minorities caused trouble. Actually physically expelling them was the solution. And Stalin believed in this. He moved ethnic groups around the map. So we have a sort of brutal clarity now, thanks to Stalin. So there is no more kind of problem, as it were. There's no sort of territorial claims or anything anymore about this.
But it's been brutally won, as you say.
Absolutely.
Really brutal.
Absolutely scar tissue. I mean, it's
Poland. Sorry, I was just going to say Poland. I hadn't realised how much of Poland was actually German. And back in the day, it was Germanic peoples on the west side of Poland, particularly. But even running through to Kaliningrad, as it is now, which is part of Russia, was Königsberg.
Yeah, Königsberg, the second capital of Prussia. It was a German city for a long time. And you had also a lot of the cities of Western Poland were sort of places like Szczecin, Wrocław, were sort of proper German cities. But yeah, there was a near complete replacement of the population of some of these cities that the Germans kicked out and replaced by Poles. What I'd like to stress about this is it wasn't really Poland's fault that this was happening. It was great power politics, and particularly Stalin, who did this. The Western Allies were really not very keen on Poland taking so much of Germany. But the reason was partly sort of defensibility, partly also because Poland had won a war against Russia in 1920-21 and extended sort of a bit to the east. The Soviet Union wanted to claim this territory back, so they took a big bite out of eastern Poland. So, I mean, Lviv in Ukraine was part of interwar Poland, but the Soviet Union seized it. And having kind of been the cause of the start of the war in 1939, the territorial integrity of Poland, Poland needed compensation from somewhere, and defeated Germany was where it was going to come from. I think also part of Stalin's calculation was that if you give Poland a lot of German territory, then Poland and Germany will never be friends, and Poland will therefore need Russia to defend them against the Germans. It didn't quite pan out that way, partly because of German politicians like Willy Brandt, who was able to recognize the new boundaries. West Germany, until the 70s, kind of still didn't recognize the new frontiers. So you would have weather maps on television which had the 1937 frontiers of Germany. So
goodness, is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's wild.
It was an absurd sort of pretense that these areas, because there'd been no sort of final treaty about it. These areas were technically under Polish civil administration in a strict legal sense. It wasn't really until the 70s that you had this acceptance that this is permanent. Once you accept that, then you can have proper conversations. And there's obviously a huge amount of historical baggage between Germans and Poles.
Quite.
And you can talk about that. You can also start to admit, this process continues and it's still going on. One of the things I find fascinating is that Polish historians and young people in Poland are quite intrigued by the German heritage of a lot of it. And it is interesting. You go for a walk and you'll find some wayside shrine and it's in German. And you're walking through Poland and you're sort of surrounded in lots of ways by modern Poland. But there are these reminders of this German history as well.
But there's something you said, actually, which did come out for the book for me, which is that Eastern Europe is kind of done to throughout history by these much larger powers, most notably Germany and Russia. I mean, Britain doesn't have clean hands in this. I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking about the Sudetenland, so-called, around the edge of Czechoslovakia as it was. Our hands were not clean at that point. Neville Chamberlain's, again, apparently appeasing Hitler in what he wanted. But just that concept of the Slavic states being knocked around by other powers constantly was a real theme, I thought, came out of your book.
Oh, very much. I mean, one of the texts I sort of took from it was Milan Kundera wrote about the Slavic people as being kind of the subjects of history. That history is something that sort of is done to them.
Yeah, they just suffer from. Yeah.
I'll quote this. Yeah, Central Europeans, according to Kundera, cannot be separated from European history. And parenthetically, this is something I was really keen to talk about in the book, to kind of talk about Europe as a whole, and to the sort of the stories same in West Europe and Eastern Europe, and indeed in our offshore island. Central Europeans cannot exist outside history, but they represent the wrong side of that history. They're its victims and outsiders. It's this disabused view of history, which is the source of their culture, of their wisdom, of the non-serious spirit that mocks grandeur and glory.
Wow.
And I think this sort of idea that these are the people who empires are done to, and I've got so much sympathy for this as well.
Yeah, but no, I mean, one assumes these borders are very soft now, largely as a part of being the European Union, which, you know, all these countries are now members. Is that right? Is there a very free flow across like the Oder-Neisse line?
The borders are very soft, yeah. I mean, the Czech-German border, the sort of, I should say, Czechoslovak-West German border was a very depopulated and fortified line during the Cold War. In 1945-48, the expulsion of the German Bohemian population meant these areas were kind of depopulated anyway. And often they weren't resettled, or they were resettled by sort of border guards and their family. And so there was this sort of depopulated strip before you even get to the border. And you can still see that history on the land there. If you go for a walk and you can find a place that used to be a farm or a village, and this metaphor occurred to me of the sort of the orchard in the forest. There was once some sort of farm, an orchard, and you suddenly find random apple trees in a forest. And that's the very Czech thing. But now the borders are very soft. You can sort of trot back and forward between them incredibly freely. In the COVID time, though, there was reimposition of border controls. And it disrupted the way people had started living their lives. There was a really touching moment when the border was shut in Szczecin, in Poland, Český Těšín on the Czech side. People put banners up saying sort of, I miss you, Poles, on the Czech side. And then the Poles on the other side put up a banner saying, we miss you, Czech.
Oh, right.
It was so sweet. And these borders which have been fought over, I mean, that border in Těšín had been the subject of a little war in 1920, and the Poles had swiped it from the Czechs in 1938. But it's all now fine. People do that. I mean, the exception, I should say, is increasingly the German border.
Okay.
The German government is quite keen now on a bit of border theatre. So you do sometimes get your passport checked coming to and fro from the Czech lands and from Poland. This is mostly on long-distance routes. Local routes, as is often the case with borders, are much less sort of policed.
So does that mean they've reopened the border posts that were closed?
They have effectively. I mean, they are skirting around the edges of the Schengen agreement.
I was going to say,
so, yes, I think you will get sort of controlled at Frankfurt an der Oder if you're on one of the longer distance trains. You can usually walk over the other bridge in the town, really, between Germany and Poland. But even then, I mean, the border posts have actually been sold off, and I think one of them is a shop, the border in Frankfurt an der Oder. So I'm not sure quite what the guards do.
And what's really prompted this?
This is sort of fear of migration.
So this is migration beyond Europe coming in?
Yeah. I mean, they're not bothered about Poles or Czechs coming through.
Right, yes.
It is about irregular migration. It's against the spirit of the Schengen Treaty, I feel. A bit of border theatre may be the price for keeping the thing going.
Yeah.
I mean, as I can tell, it doesn't really affect life in some border areas. I mean, people will still go over to Poland or whatever to have dinner at a nice restaurant. I have heard that there has been sort of racial profiling. In Frankfurt an der Oder, for instance, there is a university which kind of spans the border between the two bits. Frankfurt on the German side, Subice on the Polish side. And there have been accounts of students of minority origin getting hassled on the border.
Okay, right, okay. But nonetheless, I mean, throughout this discussion, I sort of get the impression that the people at these borders are actually more comfortable, the fact that these borders are soft, than perhaps, and this is my proposition, than perhaps people who are much further away from the borders, who are perhaps less relaxed. There's a theory for you.
I thought about this quite a bit, and in general, this is true. People at the borders can go one of two ways. Either you get people being ultra-nationalistic, and that does happen in some sort of debatable and border territories. I think it was Isaiah Berlin who observed that Napoleon and Hitler were both from marginal territories of the
Yes, of course, yeah, because wasn't Hitler's father, wasn't he a border guard or something?
He was a customs officer on the sort of border between Austria and Germany. And Corsica's claim to be French was really pretty recent and shaky when Napoleon was running France. So Stalin also, I mean, great sort of Russian imperialist leader, but a Georgian.
Right. So doesn't this upset our theory, or my theory? Anyway?
It does. And also, I think you've got a funny relationship between sort of borders and sometimes people on the British far right. I mean, William Joyce was Anglo-Irish and Lord Haw.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get too sort of into the Brexit woods, but you quite often, I mean, sort of people like Dan Hannan and so on. I mean, there is some sort of
Yes.
sense of borderishness. So I think borderishness can produce a nationalistic reaction. They need to prove that you are
Yes.
you can manage the identity crisis by becoming ultra-Russian or whatever.
Yes.
The other way, people embrace the ambiguity. And I think that's a more common thing that people actually find, particularly in border areas where identities are mixed. You get people who are more comfortable with the ambiguity and also feel less warm towards their nation states quite often. That one of the things that one observes in border zones is that often public services are underprovided. Hospitals and infrastructure and so on. Infrastructure, and particularly the roads and railway lines, often point in directions which are not actually that useful if you live in the border rather than passing through.
Yeah.
So there's a sense that people are more willing to have identities that involve the region and the supranational if they live in border areas.
Yes.
The Polish-German border is really quite interesting for this. I think the Polish people on the east side of the line, if you look at their voting behaviour, they have some of the most liberal and pro-European voting behaviour in Poland. So you have on the Polish side people who are really pretty comfortable with difference. On the German side, it's rather less so. You get sort of quite strong AfD voting, even though people are comfortable with crossing the border for daily life. I mean, it is a puzzle. I think borders create ambiguities that people resolve in sometimes quite unexpected ways.
That AfD point, though, on Germany, isn't that something of a feature of East Germany, particularly, which is what we're talking about here, isn't it? Abutting Poland.
It is. I mean, it's a general feature across East Germany. This eastern bit of Saxony, which I visited in the sort of southeast corner of Germany, is one of the strongest AfD voting areas. I think there's a particular German thing possibly about this, in that if you look at maps of voting in the 1920s, the nationalistic right was often strongest in the eastern border territories of Germany. Of course, those territories, the eastern border has moved. We're talking about sort of places that are now in Poland or whatever. But the sort of border psychosis has relocated to the new border.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's very interesting. I mean, one thing that, again, has sort of come out of this conversation, and I think comes out of the book as well, is that borders, when they were put down properly, and I think by that I mean sort of 100 years ago or thereabouts, they weren't scientific where they landed because of this complex identity that you get in some places. And obviously, as you say, Stalin tried to make them scientific and succeeded in making them cleaner, is another word. But I suppose where I was going with this is that there is an unfairness, I suppose, associated with where borders can be. And it's kind of, what do you do about that innate unfairness? You either lower the importance of the border, which is where the influence of the European Union has taken Europe, or you kind of stick with it and you make it harder. And that's where the conflict then arises, because it heightens the feeling of unfairness. That slips into resentment. And then you get the nationalist demands to change the border, which leads to conflict.
I mean, to me, there were two broad philosophies of how to manage borders now. One is the European Union philosophy of borders, which is that they're immovable. I mean, even the extreme parties in European politics are not talking about moving the borders. The idea is that the borders are fixed, but they are softening, and that they should interfere less and less with the ability of people to cross. That working across borders is something that should be facilitated. And the other philosophy of borders is that they are sort of ceasefire lines, that they reflect a balance of power, and that when the balance of power changes, the borders should change as well. And this was how stuff worked for a long time. I mean, you can see it in the tug-of-war between Germany and France over Alsace-Lorraine, and you can particularly see it in the Russian borderlands.
I was going to say, that really feels like a Russian thing.
Definitely. I think the sort of philosophy is that Russia was weak in 1991 and lost all these territories. Leave aside that the Soviet Union was supposed to be more than Greater Russia, and that a stronger Russia should push back and retake borders, and that the strongest Russia of sort of Stalin in 1945 basically pushed it to the border to the middle of Germany, of their zone of political control, and their national borders to as far as Kaliningrad. So you have, I think, fundamental conflict of values between these ideas of borders. And they produce different sorts of borders as well. I mean, I went to Estonia and saw that country's borders. And the border with Latvia is incredibly soft. I mean, you've got this border town, Valgau, where there is actually a child's swing, which will take you just sort of back and forward across the across the border. And that border is treated as a bit of a sort of, it's one of the softest borders I've visited.
It's a curiosity.
It is. And the border with Russia, though, is a very serious business. I went there in 2022 and the border was gradually closing down effectively. But even before the invasion of Ukraine, I mean, they were building new fences. And a border guard said to me that this border is the door to your house. And you want to control who comes in your house. Yet the border with Latvia was treated as a bridge, effectively. And I thought these metaphors of the door and the bridge kept coming up as I worked on the book.
Yeah, okay, interesting. So look, I'm going to bring this back a little bit home to the UK, because again, during our discussion, it's quite clear that borders have been a source of serious problems, including ethnic cleansing across mainland Europe. Whereas Britain has this sort of collective memory of her border, particularly the Channel, as stopping problems coming our way. And therefore the border is seen as useful and protective. And that seems to be quite deep in our psyche. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I mean, again, particularly of the English, and having been a polity for a long time as well, with reasonably stable borders, what we do is export our border drawing efforts to other countries. That the Treaty of Versailles, you had all sorts of English experts and French and American and so on. And at that stage, to be an expert on, say, Slovakia meant that you'd read a couple of books and you might have visited there. And so you get these sort of people who don't know a huge amount actually making these decisions about where the border should be. I mean, I think often they did their best. I mean, one of the things that struck me about this was that how much of the Treaty of Versailles and the other treaties of Paris were good faith efforts. A bit less willing to make that argument, say, for the partition line between India and Pakistan, which was one of the finer works of British cartography. I joke in the book that there are a few geopolitical problems that can't be worsened by an Englishman turning up with a pencil and a map. So we do that. We export our issues, and I don't know, maybe we think we understand them more than we do.
Well, do we export them, though? Do we export them very far? Because, I mean, the whole Northern Ireland border with Ireland, I mean, that struck me as almost being drawn overnight over a glass of wine, wasn't it?
Well, it was sort of, it took shape. And what it was is it transformed local government boundaries into an international boundary. And local government boundaries exist for very different reasons than national boundaries. And that it does create absurdities. I visited a place called the Drummully Polyp, which is this sort of little kind of blob.
Sounds painful.
It does, doesn't it? I mean, well, they haven't operated on it because there was the idea that they would tidy up the border. It was supposed to be provisional in the treaty, and there was a boundary commission, and its report was suppressed by agreement by both the British and the Irish because just reopening these issues, it was going to be too complicated and nobody really liked it. And
so it's still there. It still exists.
The border still exists, it still exists in its original form. I mean, Boundary Commission would have sorted out some of the anomalies of it, like it would have put some of the very Catholic areas of South Armagh into the Republic. It would have sorted out some of these semi-enclave kind of places along the border. But basically nobody liked the idea of... Okay. So they stuck with what they had. Partly, I mean, the Irish side, the Free State, didn't want to actually return any territory to British control. Yeah, okay. You can still sort of see why that might be. There was also the sense, if there is an eventual hope of reunification, you want Northern Ireland to be a big-ish unit where the demographics can eventually change. Yeah. And that's more or less happened now.
Yeah.
And the border cut through the sort of hinterland of places. I mean, Derry stroke Londonderry lost its hinterland in Donegal because the Irish Free State decided to impose customs controls. So there was a lot of instant economic effect from that. There was very little attempt ever to control the flow of people. I mean, the Common Travel Area agreement with the UK was signed pretty quickly. So, I mean, what there was along this border was a hell of a lot of smuggling. I mean, smuggling is always part of border stories. Alcohol, fuel, always there, cigarettes. There are ballads of people taking animals across from a farm in the Republic to the one in the north. And sort of
ballads as in little songs?
Little songs, yes. There are little songs about, I think it was a cow that's been taken across the border multiple times.
Takes all sorts, I suppose, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, so to me, the English particularly just do not understand the Northern Ireland situation. I don't think it's taught about in schools here in England. I certainly never learnt about it. You sort of learnt about it by stealth, certainly in the 70s because of the IRA's activities. But I think, and I think this was very much part of the Brexit debate, is that Brexiteers just hadn't even considered the Northern Irish border with Ireland at all. And whenever it came up, it was just sort of poo-pooed. And yet it seems to have become, and just about maintained, its position as a bit of a success story, I think. Mm-hmm. But again, it's partly because of the EU in the background. Is that right?
Yeah, the EU was always part of the architecture of Good Friday Agreement. It was something people didn't really even think about. They assumed it would always be fine, and the idea of a trade barrier appearing seemed absurd. And you had the EU also with its kind of political values of peace and all that sort of thing, and quite a lot of EU money, which still to some extent flows. I mean, there is the sort of peace programme of spending which hasn't stopped along the border there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the sort of philosophy of territory and government in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement is very different from the default one in England. It is, to some extent, yes, about maintaining this free flow of trade, and that doing this as Brexit has created massive amount of complexity. I mean, I won't pretend to understand the trading systems between the GB, NI and EU. It just seems incredibly complex. And I suppose like Bala, it kind of works because there's enough goodwill in the system. I mean, given it was kind of sort of cobbled together, the agreement has this fascinating model that psychologically people can live in either national space. You can live a life as an Irish person identifying with Ireland. You have some dealings with the UK authorities in some ways, but in terms of life, a lot of the time, if you want, you can just imagine you're in a rather special region of Ireland.
Yeah.
And you are. But also that you can live a UK life as well, psychologically.
Yeah.
And I just think this is one of the things that you do in border zones. It's a very special border zone, I think, Northern Ireland, but you can see the similarity in a few other ones where the culture and nationality don't map onto each other.
Yeah.
I thought one of the moments of the referendum campaign, and I mentioned this in the book, is when Tony Blair and John Major did a sort of joint appearance by the River Foyle in Derry stroke Londonderry. That was actually quite moving. They tried to insist, look, this is actually important and this is our responsibility to think about. And people didn't seem to listen. I thought it was quite a powerful intervention, but then
Again, I just think the English do not have an understanding of what it is. And insofar as we do have an understanding, it is awkward. It doesn't fit our view, particularly of what England and the island of Great Britain is. It sort of sits, well, it literally sits outside it. But I think culturally and psychologically, it sits outside it and doesn't work in the English mindset of very strict sea borders. I mean, I recall going to meetings a long time ago as part of the Eurosceptic movement, where we would stand there talking about this island nation. Sorry, that was a slight impersonation of Churchill. This island nation. And it's kind of, we're not even an island nation. We haven't even got that right.
No.
So how were we going to get anything else right? There was someone as well. Sorry, I have to mention this one. So I don't know if you recall, the forerunner to Vote Leave was Business for Britain, and they wrote this huge tome about how we were going to get out of the EU, essentially. The Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, had fewer mentions than Mr. Bean, which is to say it wasn't mentioned at all, and Mr. Bean managed to get one mention. And that just runs through the whole thing. But I think it's an English thing. It's not necessarily a Eurosceptic thing. It's an English thing.
Yeah. No, we have the ticket of admission to modern Europe, which is a messy land border created in 1918, 1922.
Yeah.
Lots of other places do. And the more I read the history, the more I thought that actually Northern Ireland and Silesia, for instance, you've got quite similar things going on.
Yes, which is Central Europe, is it not? Yes.
Yeah, it is. It's sort of Germany, Poland, a mixed Polish and German area, and you had some of the same kind of issues that you had people arguing that we should be part of Germany because industry needs a bigger market. And you had a referendum in 1921 where actually they voted 60-40 to stay in Germany, even though probably ethnically it was 60-40 Polish.
Interesting.
Result was that it was partitioned, and you had this sort of partition line through the industrial area, and this bizarre situation that strangely managed to work until the late 30s. I think there's a sense that the English often have that complexity about things like borders and constitutions is stuff that happens over there.
Yes.
For instance, if you look at the British attitude to constitution making, that this is something alien and we don't do that. I mean, we did do that for quite a large chunk of the world. Was pink on the atlas. I mean, we made up constitutions for half of Africa. I mean, okay, most of them didn't last, but we do that. We draw borders, we do constitutions. And I think there's this persistent sense that Northern Ireland is part of over there.
Yes, very much.
And doesn't really count. It's funny. I mean, I find the sort of difference between English nationalism and unionism as such quite an interesting phenomenon. That there is a strand of unionism which actually respects the fact that the UK is a sort of multinational state.
Yes.
But there's also a brand of right-wing philosophy which is just a greater English nationalism. That, to me, never ends up working. When you've got a country which has some sort of federal or devolved system, and a nationalism that makes the big country the dominant element, it is going to cause problems. I mean, like Russia within the Soviet Union, Prussia within Germany, Austria within the Holy Roman Empire, whatever, Serbia within Yugoslavia. There is the idea that sort of in something that is not a unitary state, there's got to be a bit of give and take.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, a lot of people just say, oh, we're British, we're different. You know, we do things in a very even-tempered way, and things just sort of work, and they last over a long period of time. And yet here we are. And some people are talking about remigration, which does come rather close, I think, to ethnic cleansing in a modern setting. Yep. You know, so are we all that good, really?
No, I mean, remigration is a horrific idea. It is ethnic cleansing. The idea that this is part of what people talk about in politics is just incredible.
Yeah.
It's BNP stuff. I mean, it originates in the United States, and some of the numbers that some of these people talk about, I mean, multiple tens of millions.
Oh, yeah. Totally.
And I mean, this is Stalin and Hitler territory. Okay, the idea that you just move people around like that. One of the things that doing the book taught me about it is how cruel these processes are. That it involves police going to somebody's door and telling them to pack their stuff up and get on a train somewhere they've never been before. It didn't make it to the final part of the book, but I read about a middle-class woman who was deported from Hamburg in 1938 because she was nominally a Polish citizen. You had all sorts of people after the First World War, you had all sorts of people whose citizenship and residence didn't match up for all kinds of reasons. You create new states and you have people who are nominally citizens of these new states, even if they... It was incredibly complicated. So, this woman was taken to this border post and dumped on the other side. And you can't do these things entirely humanely. And when people's properties are bad, what happens? I mean, you get the worst elements of society exploiting the process as well, preying on the people who are being deported, stealing their stuff when they've gone, taking their houses.
And again, it sort of comes back to, well, yeah, but we're different. We're nice people in suits who are very moderate and even... But no, this is it. Then you look across to America, and this is exactly what can happen, where they have ICE over there and all the shenanigans that have gone on with ICE in terms of just accosting people in the middle of the street and taking them away. It really is quite frightening. But I have to say, we are running out of time, and also we're probably going into areas that are slightly straying off borders. Maybe, I don't know. But
the border is not just at the border. The border is in society as well, in that a society where you have sort of papers, please, and so on, where you have to check somebody's immigration status for them to rent a flat. It's all, the border is omnipresent in that kind of society.
That is a great, great point. And a great point on which to finish, I think. Incidentally, I just have to correct, the Treaty of Verdun was year 843. So
843. Oh my goodness. I'm so well off on that. Yeah.
Well, a century. But, it wasn't. I think you ended it in a 3. So
yeah, I did. Oh my God. Sorry. I knew it was wrong when I said it, but I couldn't think what the correct one was.
It was down in that space somewhere, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Oh dear. Anyway, look, it has been a really fascinating conversation. I thank you so much. So just for listeners...
It's really good to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely, likewise. So just for listeners, that's Lewis Baston. The book is Borderlines, A History of Europe in 29 Borders, available from all good bookshops. So please do look that up. But yeah, once again, thank you so much. Great pleasure to have you on. Great to meet you at long last. And we may speak again. Who knows?
Definitely. Yes. Really nice to see you. And a fascinating chat. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.